Welcome back to Consciousness. Today's topic is Varieties of Physicalism. This is important background for many of our upcoming readings, including our first primary text, Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat? After watching this video and doing the accompanying assignment, you will have a better understanding of some of the key terms and ideas that Nagel and other philosophers use in discussing consciousness. First, let's recall the problem. On the one hand, there's the mind, including, for instance, conscious thoughts, feelings, and perceptual experiences. On the other hand, there is matter, and especially your brain. And then there's the question, what is the relationship between them? This is a very old question, and it's often simply called the mind-body problem. Next, recall that there are two basic answers to the mind-body problem. First, there is monism, according to which the world fundamentally and entirely consists of a single kind of stuff. Second, there is dualism, according to which reality has two sides, a physical side and a mental side. The most popular form of dualism is called property dualism. According to property dualism, even if the world fundamentally consists of physical stuff, some of that physical stuff has non-physical, mental properties. In this sense, the world is not entirely physical. On the other hand, the most popular form of monism is materialist monism, or simply materialism or physicalism. According to this view, the world fundamentally and entirely consists of matter. The only things that exist are physical things with physical properties. Today we're going to focus on this view. Our goal is to understand 4 different varieties of physicalism, each of which takes a different approach to explaining the mind in physical terms. Remember that the challenge for physicalism is to explain how the mind could be matter. Typically, philosophers such as David Chalmers become dualists when they conclude that the mind can't be just matter. And what typically leads them to this conclusion, these days at least, is reflection on consciousness. So let's look at how 4 main varieties of physicalism attempt to deal with consciousness. First, there is identity theory. According to identity theory, consciousness is identical with a physical event in the brain. Second, there is functionalism. It's possible to think of the brain as a piece of computing hardware that runs a variety of different programs. According to functionalism, being conscious is just a matter of running the right sort of program. And this has an important consequence. If it's just the software that matters, then you should be able to run it on different hardware. In particular, you should be able to run it on a silicon-based robot brain, and it should be possible, at least in principle, to make artificially intelligent machines. Third, there is Mysterianism. According to this view, consciousness is physical, but humans will never be able to explain consciousness in physical terms. The Mysterian thinks that, given our limited human perspective on the world, we can never explain how consciousness is physical, even if we have good reasons to believe that it is. Fourth, there is eliminativism. According to the eliminativist, consciousness, as we ordinarily think of it, is an illusion. There are brains and brain activity, and that's it. So we should just do neuroscience and not worry about so-called consciousness. The first thing to notice is that neither Mysterianism nor eliminativism offers an explanation of consciousness in physical terms. Mysterianism says that the correct explanation is forever inaccessible to us, so consciousness will always be a mystery, and there's no point in trying to explain it. And eliminativism says that there's really nothing to explain at all. While we'll talk more about these views, and especially eliminativism, later on, our main interest is in forms of physicalism that attempt to give an explanation of consciousness in physical terms. So let's take a closer look at identity theory and functionalism. Both identity theory and functionalism aim to offer what are called reductive explanations of the mind, and so of consciousness. Reductive explanations are common in science, and it's really helpful to start by looking at a couple of examples unrelated to the mind-body problem. First, take water. We now know that water is H2O. In other words, we know that the colorless, odorless liquid that we find in oceans, lakes, rivers, and streams, and that falls from the sky when it rains, is identical to the chemical compound H2O. This discovery amounts to a reductive explanation of water in chemical terms. The explanation is successful because all of the properties of water, that it freezes at 0 degrees Celsius and boils at 100 degrees Celsius and so on, are explained by properties of the chemical compound H2O. If we ask, why does water behave as it does? The answer is, because it's H2O. Second, take genes. Genes are items that function to store and transmit hereditary information in living organisms. When Watson and Crick discovered DNA, they discovered what, in all known living organisms, function as genes. This is a reductive explanation of genes in terms of DNA. Note, however, that we might someday encounter an alien species to which this explanation doesn't apply. It's not that they wouldn't have genes. Presumably, if they reproduce, then they have genes, namely items that function to store and transmit hereditary information. But do they have DNA? Maybe not. Maybe in them, something other than deoxyribonucleic acid functions as a gene. Now we have two examples of reductive explanation in science, but they're different kinds of explanation. The first explanation is an identity-based reductive explanation. It explains water by saying what it is in chemical terms. Knowing this, we know that wherever we find water in the universe, we'll find H2O. The second explanation is a functional reductive explanation. It starts by specifying a certain function, the genetic function, and then goes about discovering what, in particular cases, performs that function. There's no guarantee that the function will always be performed by the same thing, DNA. It might turn out that alien life forms have entirely different sorts of genes. And now here's your first challenge. I'd like you to think of several further examples of both identity-based and functional explanation from science. And try to think of examples from different sciences. Don't just give me a list of different reductive explanations in chemistry. Also, see if you can find examples of identity-based or functional reductive explanation outside of science, from everyday life. Pause the video here and spend some time thinking about this. Write down your answer, and then restart the video. You can always come back and add to your answer later on as well, so you have time to think of some really interesting examples. Bring your list to our next class, and we'll discuss them there. Now that you have thought of some cool examples of identity-based and functional explanation in science, and perhaps in everyday life, let's apply these ideas to consciousness. We'll start with identity-based reductive explanation. An identity-based reductive explanation of consciousness says that, just as water is identical to H2O, consciousness is identical to something that happens in the brain. For instance, maybe consciousness is identical to synchronized neural firings at 40 Hz, to take one well-known contemporary hypothesis. If so, then wherever we find consciousness in the universe, we will find synchronized neural firings at 40 Hz. What about a functional reductive explanation of consciousness? According to a functionalist approach, consciousness is whatever performs certain functions. A theory of consciousness starts by specifying those functions. Perhaps they include integration of information and causing action. Next, the functionalist must identify what performs that function in particular cases. In humans, it's something that happens in the human brain, say, synchronized neural firings at 40 Hz. And suppose that in aliens, it's something that happens in the alien brain, but it might not be synchronized neural firings at 40 Hz. Maybe it's, say, quantum effects in microtubules. So you can see that taking a functionalist approach to consciousness has a certain flexibility that the identity-based approach does not. An identity theory of consciousness commits us to saying that consciousness is always explained by the same thing, no matter where in the universe we find it. By contrast, the functionalist approach allows us to say that maybe consciousness has a different explanation in different beings. Traditionally, this has been seen as a strong point in favor of the functionalist approach to consciousness and to a functionalist approach to the mind in general. Most physicalists today are functionalists. That said, later in the course, we'll hear some pretty powerful objections against functionalism when we discuss artificial intelligence. Finally, let's sum up. In considering the question of the relationship between mind and matter, the so-called mind-body problem, we started with a contest between monism and dualism. In the case of dualism, there were two main options: substance dualism and property dualism. Today, there are very few substance dualists, since most philosophers and scientists find the idea of a non-material mind implausible. As they see it, to be a substance dualist is rather like believing in ghosts. So most contemporary dualists are property dualists. In the case of monism, there were also two main options: physicalism and idealism. Today there are very few idealists, since the idea that everything is mind seems rather implausible. And we found that physicalism about the mind has at least four forms: identity theory, functionalism, Mysterianism, and eliminativism. Neither Mysterianism nor eliminativism attempt to explain consciousness as we ordinarily understand it. For this reason, these are not terribly popular views, and we've seen why most philosophers prefer functionalism to identity theory. In conclusion, then, today the contest between monism and dualism is mainly played out as a contest between functionalism and property dualism. Next time, on to our first primary source, Thomas Nagel's classic paper, What is it like to be a bat?, which raises some very interesting challenges for all varieties of physicalism. Until then, stay conscious.